This is a brief training video which provides a high-level overview and introduction to CodeGen. As its name suggests, CodeGen is a software utility that can be used by Synergy developers to generate source code. CodeGen uses as its primary input two sources of information. The first is metadata, data about data, stored in a Synergy repository, and the second is something called a template file. We'll look at template files in a moment. Let's take a look at a simple Synergy repository. As you probably already know, the primary information stored in a repository is information about structures. Structures being the record layouts that we use in an application to define an application's data. Let's drill into the part structure in this repository and drill into the fields which are stored within that structure definition. And this is recognizable to most of us as a record layout. And bear in mind that in the repository, behind each of these fields, we've got not only the basic information about the name of the field, its data type and its size, but potentially an awful lot more information or metadata about this data structure. And CodeGen can leverage this information in order to generate usable source code. Let's back out of the field definitions and look at another piece of information that is stored within the repository, and that is information about keys. The keys define the keys on the underlying ISAM file that can be used to access that data in a structured way. And CodeGen can make use of this metadata also. And backing out of the key information, and in fact let's back out of the structure and go back to the first level of the repository, the other piece of information that CodeGen typically uses is information about files. And the file definitions in the repository are used to associate the physical data files with the record layouts or structures, and therefore the field definitions and key definitions that tie everything together. And again, CodeGen leverages this information usually quite heavily. So CodeGen uses metadata from a Synergy repository. Let's now exit from the repository and consider the second major source of information. And that is something called a template file. A template file is a source file which contains a combination of real code and code generator instructions. And those instructions are in the format of tokens. And you can see a simple example here of a template file in the help document, in the documentation for CodeGen under template files. So you can imagine that this is going to generate a function called hello world. And we've also got some tokens in here, author, which will insert the name of an author, and the current date and the current time. And that's a very, very simple example of a CodeGen template file. Let's take a look at a more realistic template. I'm going to open up Workbench, and here's a template file that I created earlier. In fact, it's one of the standard template files that ships as an example with CodeGen. And you can see if I scroll through this template file, it's quite substantial. There's an awful lot of code in here. In fact, there is the source code for many, many subroutines and functions. I think 10 or 11 function templates are included in this file. Let's go back up to the top and start to walk through. This first token is a special CodeGen token that determines the name of the output file that will be created. It's discussed in a separate video. This next section of code you will notice is preceded with semicolon // and that construct is a CodeGen template comment. So these lines, when this template is used, will not become part of the output file. They're simply used to document the template file itself. Below the CodeGen comments, now we start to get into some more real-looking code. This is Synergy DBL code. I mentioned that CodeGen is used to create source code. It's useful to Synergy developers because of its reliance on the Synergy repository, but it's in no way limited to producing Synergy source code. This template is is a template for Synergy source code, but we could just easily generate, just as easily generate source code for other languages too. So what we've got here is a documentation header. And as you can see, we've got some tokens in here as well. So CodeGen's going to insert the name of the author and the name of their company and the date and time that the code was generated. And these are all going to be comments at the top of the generated file. And then we get into a function definition. And you'll recognize this as Synergy source code. However, again, there are CodeGen tokens interspersed with the real source code. And what CodeGen's going to do when this template is processed in conjunction with a repository structure is it's going to replace these tokens generally with information from the repository structure or from a field or from a key or something like that. So let's imagine we're going to process this template in conjunction with the part structure from our repository, this is going to produce a function called part exists. I'm not really going to focus on too much on what this template file does. In fact, it produces code that uses the Synergy SQL Connection API to interact with a relational database, and the exists function simply goes off and checks whether a particular table exists within the relational database. So you can see here is a SQL statement that for SQL Server interrogates the SQL Server dictionary and basically determines whether a table based on the name of a structure, part in this case, exists within the database, and it executes that SQL statement and returns a value. Let's look a little further down. Here we've got template code for a routine called something create, part create, if we use the part structure. And what this routine will do is it will produce source code that will create a part table in the relational database. So if we look down, it's no surprise that we find something, the building of a SQL statement, create table based on the name of the structure. And then we have another kind of token, and this token is called a field loop. A field loop is a way of iterating through all of the fields available in the structure that's being generated. And there's a separate video on the subject of field loops. Remember what this code looks like here. We'll look back at this section of code once we look at the code that was generated from this template. I'm not going to go too much further. Here we've got the use of an alternate key loop. So now we've got SQL create index statements based on keys that are defined within the underlying Synergy repository structure. So we're going to create a table in the relational database that looks like the structure layout, and we're going to put indexes on that table based on the key definitions in the Synergy repository. Again, we're not too interested in what this specific template does, more in the concept of combining real source code with tokens and instructions. And now you'll realize that tokens are generally either going to be replaced with something, the name of the author, the name of the company, the name of the structure that's being processed, or they're going to cause the code generator to take some action, iterate through all the fields, iterate through all the keys, and so on. So that's basically what a template file looks like. Let's give you an example of how CodeGen would actually be used, combining the part structure from the repository with this template file that we've now taken a very brief look at. We're going to go to a command prompt, and I'm going to issue a CodeGen command. So I'm going to say CodeGen. I'm going to specify the name of the template file that I want to use, and you can see from the very top of the screen there, the name of the template is database routines, and we're going to specify with the -s option the name of the repository structure that we want to use in conjunction with the template, and the name of the structure we'll use is part. And I'm going to hit the enter key, and one file failed. Why is that? Okay, the reason is I've forgotten I'd previously executed this command and the file already exists, part.sql.dbl. CodeGen by default will not overwrite existing source code. So if I want to tell it to overwrite existing source code, then I need to add the -r for replace command line option, and now it should tell me one file created. In fact, if I want to see which file is created, I could use an optional -lf command line option, and it will tell me one file created, part.sql.dbl. Let's take a look at that file that was generated in conjunction with the template that it was generated from. So here's the template that we started to look through a moment ago, and here's the resulting code. And you'll notice that the CodeGen file name has been used to set the name of the output file. All of the documentation comments for the template that we discussed earlier are not present in the generated code, and the first line of the generated code basically starts here. And as we look down, we can see we've got the routine was structure name exists in the template, and in the generated source code, its part exists. So the structure name token has been replaced with the name of the structure part. Author has been replaced with my name. Company has been replaced with my company. Date and time have been replaced with the current date and time when the source code was generated. And as we look further down the code, I'm not going to go through every line of this template, but you'll notice that this line of text we discussed earlier, where we're determining if a table exists in the database, and you'll see that here we had structure name, and as we scroll down the actual generated source code, you'll see that that's been replaced by the name of the structure part. Another example that we looked at in some detail, if we scroll down a little bit further, was in the create routine template. And if you remember, we said we had this SQL statement being built, create table structure name, and we had this field loop that was going to have code output for every field in the structure. Let's take a look at what that looks like in the generated code. So as we scroll down, we should find here's the create routine, and here's the block of code that was generated. So for every line in that field loop, we've got a column being created in the database. And we're using relational database types here. Varchar20 was the field SQL type. It's a SQL Server data type appropriate for the underlying Synergy field, which in this case was an A20. And in a relational database, a varchar20 has been inserted as appropriate. One other thing we looked at was we looked briefly at the use of this alternate key loop. The reason we're using an alternate key loop will process all keys apart from the primary key. The reason is that if we look at the generated code, when creating a SQL table, you have a constraint primary key clustered based on the primary key field. So the primary key definition is based on, or is implemented by the create table command, and therefore we need to add indexes for only the alternate keys. So we had this alternate key loop, which was essentially doing a create index command for each of the keys. And if we look at the generated code, we should find that we've got create index 1, which is on the group ID field. We've got create index 2, which is on the supplier field, and so on. And these are based on the key definitions in the underlying repository. Hopefully that gives you a brief understanding of what CodeGen is and what it does. If you want more information or want to know where to get started, then a great place to go is the CodeGen part of the Codeplex website, so codegen.codeplex.com. There you will find some documentation, some basic information about what CodeGen is and how it works. But the best thing to do is to download and install CodeGen, and then you can refer to the documentation. You can access the documentation using a CodeGen command, codegen-docs. And that will display the online documentation that has much more information about what CodeGen is, what it can do for you, and how to go about using it. If you're not working on the Windows platform or you don't want to install CodeGen, another place you can go to get the documentation is the CodeGen documentation site, and you can find that at codegen.synergex.com/help.